So I want to make 3 points about the theme, evaluating teaching in a research university. It's really important, it's really hard, and it takes collaboration. So I'm going to take each one of these in turn. On the point about it being really important, one of our Graduate School of Education faculty members who does research on teaching effectiveness in the K-12 sphere was corresponding with me and others recently and noted that when you compare student achievement gains between schools or between teachers within a particular school, the difference between teachers within a particular school is 2 to 4 times greater than between schools. What that means is that teaching effectiveness, more than school culture, is really what we should pay attention to. And the way he thought about the implication for higher ed, given that research in K-12, is that if we care at Harvard, not just about bringing in the smartest and the best students who are going to do great, they're just going to do great because they're so great when they come in. If we care about the so-called value added, then there may be no other issue that is important as evaluating teaching and teaching skills. So the second point is coming back to those issues around that I mentioned about these lunches and dinners, putting down the foundation for what the theme of a conference would be. What we heard in the past couple of years, in particularly the faculty get-togethers, always, every one of these discussions, there would be a moment where somebody would say, how do we know? How do we know what we're doing, or whether if we try things, it's any good? How do we understand whether what we're doing matters? And so that question of evaluating what works and what doesn't is really important and crucial to the faculty who are coming to these discussions. And then there's a second point about it that I think is really important, which is evaluation makes people vulnerable. It's hard to be evaluated for anybody. That's human nature. It's hard to be evaluated. And so what we heard in these discussions among faculty also is the incredible care that they have for teaching and wanting to do well, and the vulnerability that they feel over course evaluation, the structure of the university and how we incentivize teaching or don't incentivize teaching. I want to just say, like, at these dinners, there were tears. There was intense moments because it really matters to people. So that's point 1, importance. Point 2, it's hard. Thanks to the amazing team of archives at the Harvard University Library, we found out that people at Harvard have been thinking about these same issues for a long time. So at least since 1874, in the 1874-1875 annual report of the president to the overseers, there were suggestions about ways to improve teaching so that, quote, even the most indifferent student will find it desirable to attend. And so that these two, quote, banes, the banes being absenteeism in body or mind, and the second one being cramming, will become less prevalent. In 1902, a committee on improving instruction surveyed all faculty and all students, and the responses are in these paper volumes that are just beautiful. There's these giant yellowed, rough-edged volumes that exist in our libraries, and you can go through and you can look at these handwritten comments that students wrote and instructors wrote, and the themes are really the same. The language is really different. There was a department of hygiene, a department of mineralogy. Those departments don't exist, but the students would say, I got this one quote that I liked, my style was often criticized as stiff, and justly so, but when one's stock of interesting themes is gone, one cannot help being stiff. Now, I don't think that's the way a student would talk now, but they might mean the same thing when they talk about something that came up in a classroom. In the report, and the report was authored by a group of faculty, one of whom was Lowell, before he was president of Harvard, It brought up issues like the average amount of studying was discreditably small. Problems with large lecture courses, but that they were here to stay. Large lecture courses have problems, but they're here to stay. They suggested the use of frequent quizzes, which we now know is really important for teaching and learning. They talked about the bifurcation of students who were either interested to go deep and have specialized knowledge to kind of go in an academic way, or those who really needed general background, and how to try to design a curriculum that met both of those needs. They recommended some changes, and they urged that instructors should read the comments of the students in their own courses, and that the chairs of departments should read the comments of all of the students and the faculty within a department. And as far as I can tell, and I would love to know differently, all of the efforts that came after that, no one knew that there was a precursor to course evaluations in 1902. It's just, we just keep reinventing things. All right, just to give a sense of how this keeps coming up, there was a report of the Committee on Instruction in 1927, a report in 1945, a series of essays in 1969. Through the 70s and the 80s, there were a bunch of efforts that, as far as I can tell, were led by President Bach and Dean Rosofsky at the time. And that really was around trying to formalize course evaluations. A report of the Task Force on Pedagogical Improvement in 1977 takes multiple pages to lay out how to evaluate teaching, guidelines for how to evaluate teaching. You could have written it today. It's a great summary of all the things that you could do. It's multi-method. It's there. I'm not going to keep listing these throughout time. I want to read one note from a letter. From a professor of English and comparative literature. It was written in 1975 to his dean, and I just thought it helped to underscore another way in which these issues are hard. The only thing that can conceivably be said in favor of the course evaluation project is that its finished product is virtually unreadable. But I would sooner resign my professorship at Harvard than collaborate in any way with such a hateful undertaking, which demeans those who participate in it, goes against everything Harvard ought to stand for, and is postulated on an almost total misunderstanding of what education is about. It seems to me a graphic example of the perversion of values that characterizes the entire undertaking that the Dean of Undergraduate Affairs should ask me to forego 15 minutes of educational time to enable students to fill out a meaningless questionnaire. It is also, I might add, practically impossible. My lectures are not haphazard musings. They are each carefully contrived to present a specific body of material to precisely 53 minutes. So it's hard to make change at this institution. So to the last point, requires collaboration. I think it's precisely because it's so hard. Meaningful evaluation of teaching, it requires collaboration and trust across different roles. And again, I want to pause for a moment and come back to today. We've designed this conference with people with lots of different roles on purpose. Partnerships between academic professional staff who support teaching and learning and instructors and faculty and deans are so important, and building up those lines of trust if we want to make difference is so important. When I think about really trying to make progress on evaluating teaching, I think there's no way it doesn't involve chairs of departments, faculty and instructors talking with one another, really listening to students. What do students need? What do they care about? Where do they come in, understanding or not understanding? How do they think about teaching? How do they think about their instructors? And this is something that we in HILT have not been able to do as well as I would like to. An initiative around learning and teaching. How do we involve students? I think it's critically important that we all do better at listening to our students. I would like to invite President Faust and our distinguished university professors to come up, and we'll start this conversation.
Thank you, Erin. I loved listening to those historical tidbits, obviously. I'm a historian. But Erin shared a substantial amount of material with us about the past as preparation for this panel. So I thought it might be good to begin with that. By the way, does everyone know who's up here? You have bios, and I don't have to introduce anybody? Should I introduce people? No. OK. So I thought I'd just begin by asking your reflections on the opportunity that Erin gave us to dive into some of the elements of the past. And I'll go historian to historian here to start. Anne, begin, if you would.
Well, I thought the research was terrific. And obviously, her point that these issues have long been with us is amazing. The students seem to have gotten to it first. So in 1925, they set up the Confi Guide, which was still going in the 80s when I was an undergraduate, but then sort of faded at some point between then and now as Q really stepped up its work. What really struck me was a comment from a student in, I think it was the 1902 survey that she described, saying that he had taken a particular course with a particular goal, and he'd gotten what he wanted out of it, the literary work, the grade he'd hoped for, but he hadn't felt it as satisfying. And he says, as is usual when one engages in things for mercenary purposes. So that was a fascinating entry into how students even then were conscious of their different motives for taking courses. And one always hopes that students take courses out of interest.
Other reflections, Gary or Doug?
First of all, congratulations on your promotion back to the faculty.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I think the history was great because in the social and behavioral sciences, Drew is going from division to division, we actually know a lot more about evaluation and about how to elicit information from people than they did in 1875. So right now we're evaluating at the wrong time. We're asking the wrong questions, and we have the wrong outcome variable. So it's the wrong time because imagine the Olympic diving practice where someone dives and the coach says, nope, your toe was wrong. Get up, do it again. And then they do it again and they say, no, your leg went off. Suppose instead the coach said, just watched for the whole weekend. And then at the end of the weekend, they patted somebody on the back and said, good job. How much would they learn? Not very much. So if you want us as teachers to learn, you don't evaluate once at the end of the year. You do it in continuous time. That doesn't mean that you ask students questions in continuous time. You find ways of doing it in unobtrusive ways that doesn't get in the way of teaching. But it needs to be frequent. Instant feedback helps learning of students and of faculty as well. Second, they're the wrong questions a lot of times. You don't want, if you go have an operation at the hospital, you don't, suppose they ask you a survey, how was the doctor's technique? It's just like, that's not information you actually have. If we want to know who's going to win the presidential election, we don't ask a random sample of people who you think is going to win the presidential election for each and every person, because you don't have access to that information unless you happen to be a researcher, right? We ask you what you know, which is, who are you going to vote for? So we need to ask the questions the right way. And finally, the outcome is not whether the students say they learned. It's whether they actually learned, right? And whether they remember it a long time from now, right? And so we should measure the things that we actually care about. We actually know about these things now. We should bring some social science into what we're studying.
Doug, any thoughts?
I agree with what Gary said. What struck me in reading it was maybe dispiriting in the sense that things haven't really changed, that the challenge between the teacher and the student remains the same. Students want to be maybe entertained or have some other reason for taking the class, and the teachers are trying to convey information. And that, I don't know what that's called, that contract or that interaction remains a challenge. But what struck me more than anything was that Harvard professors gave low grades. There were many comments about A's, B's, C's, and D's. And I mean, if I were to ask in this room to raise your hand if you've given a D, let's see how many people have given a D. Yeah, right. It's a very small number. And so grade inflation has been the biggest change, I would say, comparing to what they were concerned about and how we evaluate students now. But Gary brought up another point that also struck me. It made me think about evaluations in the longer term. And if I had any idea about how to change evaluation, and I don't have many ideas, one would be to Erin's point of cooperation, to engage with the, I forgot what HAA stands for, Harvard Alumni Association, yes. And to give tests or evaluations 5 years after students have graduated, to ask them, what do you remember, what's been useful? And that would challenge departments and the faculty, like what kinds of questions would you want to ask, which would clearly be different from what you would ask, as Gary said, you know, during the rush of learning the discipline at the time.
You know, I get a kind of anecdotal window into that often when I'm meeting with alums. One of my favorite aspects of that is when one will tell me, I will never forget this course that I took 25 years ago, and I've thought about it every day. And maybe I should be more systematic and make a list and at least tell the people who they're still alive what the course was. If I can say something about what Erin said that makes me a little more optimistic than the assertion that nothing's changed, it just seems to me the way everyone laughed at the comment from the comparative lit professor in 1975, is that right? That's the year I got my PhD, so it doesn't seem all that distant in time to me. But no one would dare say that now, right? It's more embedded in our expectations of ourselves and our students' expectations of us that there will be evaluations. And it was while I was at Harvard, I can't remember if I was at Radcliffe or was yet president, that the Faculty of Arts and Sciences voted that there should be course evaluations in every course. Up until then, it was voluntary. So I think it's become more a part of the culture that there should be evaluation of teaching. One thing, Gary, that your comments raised in my mind and that I've been thinking about since we began having conversations about this session is, if we're thinking about what successful teaching is, that's so hard to define. Is it helpful to think about what is unsuccessful teaching? And what would be information about teaching that you would think, this is a sign it's not working?
So I'm going to connect your last 2 points. So I actually did collect some of the information you thought of collecting systematically. Only I have a much narrower sample. So my sample is I go and, like everyone else here, go to give talks at other universities. And I'll see a student that took my course 20 years ago. And so what I started doing a few years ago is asking them about it. And what they say is, you know, I remember when you did that thing. Are you still doing that thing? And you know, most of the time the answer is yes, but I actually want to know whether I'm doing that thing, right? And so I actually have a systematic collection.
What is that thing? Is it some kind of?
That's right. So that thing is different for different people.
Oh, okay.
But that's the way they describe it. You know? Okay. I mean, I could describe it now, but probably not. Probably shouldn't. But so I collected those things, and then I went to psychology and asked them, well, what things do we remember 20 years from now, right? And so the answer, so there's actually an answer, which helps me design new classes. So the answer is that there are things that are surprising, unusual, and have emotional content. So if you can't make your students cry, then then you can make them laugh. You can make them, you can make them, surprised and interested. But doing something different. You know, I do this thing where I climb up on chairs for a particular substantive purpose. Like, you don't want them to remember that you did something dumb. You want them to remember that it connects to some intellectual point. So there's research on this too.
Any thoughts about unsuccessful teaching, Anne? Or Gary, you had
sorry, just to connect it, was the unsuccessful part was all the parts that they didn't remember. Oh my gosh. Like that, in some sense, that's why we teach, right? If they don't take it with them, then what's the point, right?
Well, on the notion of asking alums. First of all, it's going to be hard. It's hard enough to get our undergraduates to fill out those questionnaires, and now we've made them conditional. They can get their grades early if they fill them out. So that got our percentage of completion much heightened to the 90s percentages, and still it's not 100% now. So I worry about asking alums to do tests. Obviously, that's not going to necessarily work.
But, I was just thinking there are all these surveys that the HAA takes of alums. Like, did you ever hear about the sex survey that one class took? Every single alum showed up for the session on that reunion. But I wonder if they do put questions about teaching into HAA surveys. We should think about that. I think that'd be fascinating. Anyway, excuse me for interrupting.
I think the nice question to ask is what kind of course also do they remember? Was it the elective or the thing they took sort of at the last minute or on a whim? Or was it a required course or especially a vivid one? I think, yeah, clearly just remembering which courses you took is the first hurdle. And if you can get remembered for something you did in class, it's a tremendous success.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever had an experience where you thought this was an unsuccessful teaching experience and you thought again about how you were approaching something?
Yeah, I mean, usually I'm, well, revamping a course and restructuring it, deciding that, and I think I'm still wanting to restructure the course I'm currently teaching on the history of the book. So I've never felt like a complete disaster, usually, but of course, immediately after lecturing, I always have a list of things I wish I'd said. And of course, now I've learned the thing to do is to write those down and to put them at the top of the lecture for next time, so that they can get factored in earlier. And restructuring, I suppose that's the challenge that it might be good to share with students, is how teaching is a constant set of decisions about trade-offs, and there isn't a perfect solution, frankly. And so sometimes, I remember one of the questions we got in the head was, what's a most powerful question you'd ask a student? And I was thinking I might ask them, what would you do differently? You know, to ask them to put themselves in my position of having to, you know, structure a course and make decisions that work more or less well for different people, too. We're talking to so many different audiences in the same classroom.
So all three of you are university professors, highly honored scholars and teachers and members of the community, and that both reflects your impact on the university as a whole, but also encourages you to reach beyond your own fields and your own particular disciplines. How is teaching different? What have your experiences been teaching outside the particular field or area in which you got your graduate degree or in which you were originally identified? What's that been like? And what have you learned from that?
Well, maybe I'll take a stab at it. If I think of what's been the best learning experience for me, it's teaching a course with a person many of you know, Michael Sandel, called Biotechnology and the Future of Human Nature. And I've learned a lot about teaching from teaching with Michael, who's really an excellent professor. But the broader question you ask is, what's it like to, say, teach in the medical school versus the college, or teach different kinds of courses? I find each experience quite different. Frankly, I don't enjoy much, and I do rather little, of teaching of medical students, because they're, on the whole, trying to learn a discipline and learn facts. The graduate students are different. Maybe one of the most enjoyable things I do, but I don't do it very often, every few years, is teach a freshman seminar, because that's so fun, because they don't know what to expect, and it's really nice to just have people completely come unbiased to say what college is going to be like. I guess the other thing I've learned is, unfortunately, impractical. If you ask me, how would I, to Gary's point, best evaluate teaching, it's by oral exams. And I only give those as make-up exams, because, I mean, even for a class of 20 students, you can't give 23-hour oral exams. It's just not possible. If someone could solve that problem, I think an oral exam is probably the best way to evaluate teaching. But we can't do it. So that's not a very good answer.
Not correct.
Right?
Well, this semester I'm for the first time teaching an extension in addition to teaching in the college. And I'm very grateful for the way the Extension School has worked out lots of pieces of technology and ways of using technology as part of your teaching, which I'm trying to take on board even in the classroom, too. And it makes one aware, obviously, of the Extension School students are very different. Being a bit older, not necessarily, though. I have a high school student in there. And yeah, it's a feeling of reaching out beyond just our little world is a good one, I think, although obviously there are limits to how that can be done, but I'm very pleased to be doing
Do you
that.
find that these students bring different questions to the material?
Absolutely, and they also are each very passionate about it. They're putting more on the line, as it were, you know, taking time out of working lives and expense for that course, which is a very unusual interaction. Like, is this course worth what you're spending on it? Which is thankfully not a question I have to ask the undergrads in quite that direct a way. But it does mean they're also very invested. And they do bring different questions. Sometimes because it's been a long time since they've taken a course or had a grand scheme of historical periodization. But it's really helpful. I mean, I learned a tremendous amount from my students, you know, also the undergraduates, of course. I mean, that's what's so great about teaching, is that it's constantly a learning experience oneself.
So I teach this course where I have students from lots of different schools, and the undergraduates as well, and graduate students. And I've actually had students from every school, but unfortunately not in the same semester. But there are lots. And what you said actually is exactly my experience. It's the questions they ask. That's really the only thing that differs across the areas, because they're united by their interest in research in some way, or the products of research, or maybe doing it. I teach methods, so it's sort of how to do it. And actually, I've myself actually been trying to write something on exactly this question, and I'm designing a component of my class for the spring. That's the issue is that from kindergarten up through graduate school, people are given a question, and then good students do their absolute best to answer that immutable, unchangeable, fixed question. But the moment we graduate, right, we're given any question we want. We can change the question along the way. If we're researchers and we've decided to go interview Indian legislators, but we trip over an archive of interesting information in New Jersey, like a great thing to do is to switch topics, right? Students are never given that task. And so I've often tried to get them to change the question, but it's much easier in the context of people whose discipline defines questions in different ways. So when the undergraduates see people from the School of Public Health, and they realize that could be an interesting question, or you know, or across all the schools. And so I'm trying to figure out how to bottle that, but
because that's an important part of the learning process. They're learning from the different culture of public health, or the different culture of whatever. That's
like
great.
In their silo, they learn what is culturally important in that group of people, right? And they're very different groups. Like in economics, you take 2 graduate students, send them to different graduate schools on different parts of the planet. They take the same courses. You take 2 political scientists, send them to the same program. They take different courses. In public health or in medicine or whatever it is, they analyze questions very deeply that in many areas, you would never think in the sciences would be acceptable as a broad enough area. But we need people doing that. And so giving people the understanding that, you know what, there could be an audience for your interesting question in a different area. And and what is an interesting question is just, it's culturally defined. And you can find an important question in lots of different areas can be important.
Listening to Gary reminds me that one thing I think the university's done extremely well, and you've supported, Drew, is to bring to us a much more diverse student body. And that's definitely changed in my time here. And I think, for me, one of our next challenges now is to change this national discussion about what do I get out of college in terms of how much money I'll make or what job I'll get, and recenter the discussion on changing who you are as a person, you know, how to think, what a liberal arts education means. And I think our nation is losing that aspect of advanced education. I don't have any idea what to do about it, but I mean, I think...
Well, I think you raise a really important point, which is the external pressures that would have us evaluate our teaching and our effectiveness based on salary at first job. That was one suggestion that is so reductionist. And I'm often asked, well, what would you use instead? So that really puts the question of how do we evaluate front and center in defining what our mission is. Because essentially this question of evaluation is what makes us a successful institution and what doesn't. So it's really has enormous implications, as you point out, Doug, I think is true. Well, Gary, you kind of started this off with a pretty searing critique of the current way of evaluating, or at least with student evaluations. Do you think they have any use? Should they be supplemented? Should they be abandoned? And how would you move us to the suggestions that you put
Sure.
forward?
We're in the era of big data, right, of the ability to collect and analyze many more forms of information than we ever had before. The books that Erin found by sleuthing through the library have unstructured text, which, you know, for a century we didn't know how to analyze, and there were too many of them to read and really comprehend all at once because there's so many different classes. Actually, we know how to analyze them now. What a great project for somebody. Somebody should go back and do that. But I think we should go collect a lot of forms of information. I don't want my teaching evaluated based only on whether students get a job that make a lot of money and at a famous place, or whatever it is. But I would like to know that information. Moreover, I think my students might like to know that information as one of many components. And actually, there's a lot more. So I think with digital technology in particular, we can give faculty continuous time feedback on certain aspects of what they do, exactly how students read. Eric Mazur and I have a project called Perusal, where students read and they annotate a reading and collaboratively answer each other's questions. We then know every movement they make, everything they're reading, everything about it. We use that for them. So it feeds back information to them. And we can say, you know, you're reading in a particular way that in previous semesters hasn't really worked. Here's a suggestion, all in an automated, non-humiliating private way. Similarly, if the instructor is assigning something that is not working, the instructor gets to know. If there's material that, on particular pages, that students don't understand or are engaging with because they're making comments or they're going back to it and they're reading it again, we can print off, and we do, a one-page student confusion report that the instructor can walk into the class the next time and just say, you know, there's 3 things that you're confused about, which is so much better than what I used to do, which is I would walk into class and say, any questions? They all have questions. They never know them when you ask them, right? Because they just tromped across campus. They dropped their book bag and their coat, and they're preparing to be entertained, right? But if we actually, but actually know what's going to generate the question. So there's 3 things that you don't understand. Here's the first one. And then they ask questions because they remember what it is. So
I
this
love
is
the idea of a confusion report.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of all kinds of ways we could benefit from confusion reports. And are there things you'd like to know about your teaching? I mean, you said you'd like to know what someone thinks 10 years later. But other than that, or in addition to that?
I think one thing I learned from the Bach Center actually is this quick response survey at the end of class. One thing you learned, one question you have, and sort of sending around an index card is the fashioned way of doing that and collecting them, which actually then gives you fodder to start up next time. But I have also used clickers to, you know, ask questions that I wouldn't want even a show of hands for, but that people can answer. So yes, I think some kind of continuous feedback would be fantastic. So at the level of the lecture or the class meeting. And then also, I think a mid-semester questionnaire, I think, is key in any case. And they're a quick form that people check boxes off, so there's no handwriting and so on. But even a kind of a journal, I think, would be good. If we could ask students to think about what's going on, I don't know, every 2 weeks or something like that. And actually, I think for me to keep a journal would also be good. I'm trying to do more of that, so annotate my syllabus for my own use next time, you know, what worked, what didn't work, and so on. So that we could have, and then how that might be shared, I don't know, if the continuous thoughtfulness of thinking about the process of teaching and of learning. Actually, one thing I find really helpful in a freshman discussion group, you know, in those opening days, was to ask, you know, what their vision of teaching is. You know, is it, I suppose one of the classic models is you kind of the picture of stuff that you're pouring into someone's brain. And, you know, obviously, no one can, that is actually an underlying metaphor that a lot of people have, and yet when you think about it, it's ridiculous. You know, you're asking someone to form in their own brain, on their own, by interaction with their peers, us, and just to get them thinking about what learning means and what might be involved on their part versus my part, you know, I think is great. So more metacognition all along the way, maybe. Obviously, you don't want to overanalyze. That's another risk, you know.
Right. Doug, any thoughts on this?
Well, I agree with what's been said. Another aspect I think we might consider is something I know I've discussed with Rob Liu and Bill Anderson and others, is using, it's more difficult to do, but is using the faculty to evaluate the teaching. That's really very touchy business, right? Is to have, your colleagues come into class and say, you know, that was a terrible
routine
lecture.
in the law school
and the business school it is, right, but I can tell you it's a touchy business in the FAS. Okay, and I think that that's something that we should somehow encourage more. We had an unfortunately bad experience in my department where I think we try to pride ourselves on good teaching. As a new course was offered, and it was by any measure a failure. The faculty didn't think it went well, and the students didn't. And so we had a faculty meeting with the 2 faculty members who taught it and a lot of student feedback. And that turned out to be a very good event, is to say this is our responsibility as a department to make this course better. How do we help you teach it better? How do we listen to student complaints, really? There were complaints. But I don't have a good idea. I know more about how the business school does it, where they have people sit in on classes. That takes faculty time. I don't know how to solve it, but I think in terms of evaluating teachers as well as students. I guess part of this is, I don't know about others, but I find the Q Guide very hard to read for my own assessments. I tend to focus, because of my ego, I guess, on all these bad comments, you know, and those are the ones I remember. He was a terrible teacher, he didn't care about students, he was unavailable, he was intimidating. And even if that's a small number of them, those are the ones that I remember. So I started to not read them so often. I wait till the summer and read them when I'm on vacation or something like that.
We've been focused on teaching as classroom, I think, mostly here. And one of the things that I'm struck by when I see ad hoc files and we're trying to evaluate teaching by people who are being suggested for promotion or appointment is there are many kinds of teaching. And not everybody is a performer in a large lecture course or the kind of charismatic actor that is so valued in a student evaluation. So how do we think about the other dimensions of teaching? The ones being a thesis advisor, being in a small group. And Doug, I was thinking that you also are involved in a form of teaching that goes beyond the academic program itself in your role as a faculty dean at Elliott House. You are teaching day and night, and that is the Harvard model for the college, that teaching takes place everywhere. So how do we think about evaluating, I mean, what do I do when I get a ad hoc file and I'm thinking about teaching and wondering, is someone a good graduate teacher, a good mentor, a good colleague in teaching junior faculty?
I would say I wouldn't pay too much attention to the Q Guide scores. I'm not convinced that that's the best measure. I think it's helpful to some, but I don't think that's the best measure. But you're right that the one house I know, Elliott House, when I ask the students, the most interesting conversations about how they weave together the things they've learned in, you know, Anne or Gary's course and try to make those connections. And so how we do that as a faculty is a real challenge. The other thing I'm sorry to tell you all is when I usually ask them who's teaching that course, they can't remember the name of the professor. They have no idea. They can sometimes describe what he or she looks like, but they seldom know the professor's name. That I find surprising, but it is a universal fact among the students, particularly if the course was taught last year. They have no idea. They have to look it up on their iPhone to remember who taught them.
I find that when I ask students, you know, making conversation, when I interact with students, so you're taking X, who's teaching it? Thoughts about teaching outside.
So I didn't really answer your question about, in your position on the ad hocs, how to evaluate teaching. That's an important issue. I don't know. What do you two think?
Well, one-on-one teaching is a crucial part of what goes on in the humanities with thesis, and those people will remember who their thesis advisor was.
Yes, that's right.
That's one where the teacher actually, I think, sticks. And one thing I have seen done at other institutions is to have students write for their teachers, actually. But it is difficult to get insight into that very direct. Obviously, though, you can judge by how many, perhaps, in some cases, someone who, because there's a lot of word of mouth, I think, which sort of translates into student behavior. I would say the Q Guide is doing a real service to the students in terms of advising them. A lot of the science courses will say, well, I had this background and I thought this course was hard or easy. And, those kinds of things are valuable student-to-student advice. I agree about when to read one's Q scores. It's like, well, after the fact, when relaxed, and when, having a chance to sort of decompress afterwards, because they're always inevitable disappointments. One thought that someone suggested is you could throw out the lowest eval and the highest eval, sort of in a way of detracting from the overall score being brought down by a fluke. And the other phenomenon to be aware of too is that the bigger the course, the lower the score, then the course shrinks, then the course gets higher Q scores, then the course grows, then it gets lower Q scores, and on we go. I mean, that's sort of the cycle that,
yes.
So I suppose that the course reaches an equilibrium somewhere in between this, these gyrations. But it's hard. For you to get a view is difficult.
Yeah, so Gary, is there a way to use big data to evaluate?
Well,
I mean,
the answer is always yes, but I'm going to give a different question.
That's comforting.
So I think even the amazing people that you consider at these ad hocs have a finite amount of time in their lives. And so one of the additional questions that I would hope you would ask is their teaching and research life incentive compatible with each other? And because if it's not, then they may be devoting as much time as they can to research and as much time they can to teaching. But if they're teaching something unrelated to the research, they're just not going to be doing as well at the sum of the two. So, and this is actually important for another reason. I think that we want all of the people that go through the ad hoc, and you're shaking your head yes. They all are going to be above some level of teaching, but 100% of them, without any question, are going to be great researchers. And we have to spend most of the time in the ad hoc on their research. So the thing that gets them up in the morning, the thing that got most people here, the thing that is of most interest and most exciting to people actually is research. But if you want to be a great teacher, what do you teach? What gets you excited? That's the thing that's going to be most interesting to the students. It's your research. So I think, and then let's think of it from the student perspective. I think it is almost a travesty for a student to go 4 years through an institution like this and not at least once have an experience where they're sitting at the table making some contribution that they're capable of making when they see a discovery being made. I'm not talking about them doing research. They should do that, but that's separate. I mean, when Doug or Ann says, aha, that is a life-changing experience akin to the kind of stories that we tell about when a student goes to a foreign country and spends a year. But this is an experience that Harvard can give them. So that's the question I would ask.
So that raises the question of how is teaching different and special in a research university? And I think you've framed an important aspect of that in what you've just said. Any other thoughts about the research-teaching connection, Ann or Doug? I think
it's a very tight one for me, absolutely. And I suppose that speaks to how many different kinds of courses one teaches. I always feel that you should stretch yourself and teach in different, but then you're actually actively researching one of those different areas you might be teaching in. And that's a delicate balance, as you say, because on the one hand, by teaching things that are sort of adjacent to your current research, you're bringing in new insights into that research, and yet if you spread yourself too thin, then maybe you don't have the same level of enthusiasm or ability to translate research into teaching. So it is a delicate balance. But I think the two that is the excitement, really. And of course, there's graduate teaching that's happening in here too, and that the undergraduate teaching is also mentoring graduate student teachers of those undergraduates, and when all three levels sync nicely, it's really great.
Now that I think of it, it relates to your question about how you evaluate teaching, and maybe I'll exaggerate a bit, but I don't think in the natural sciences an undergraduate would ever say the thing that changed their life was a course they took. It was instead the lab in which they worked. It was, to Ann's point, about establishing a relationship with a mentor and a teacher that they saw out of class. And I don't actually know how much that counts in the ad hoc. I can't remember. But I mean, same in my lab, which I know best, there are about 7 to 10 undergraduates every term, working in the lab. I don't even think I get credit for that. Maybe I do. I can't remember how that counts. But I mean, that's sort of the most intense teaching that you do in a laboratory. And again, I know Rob Lou's been very keen on making laboratory experiences available for undergraduates. And the way we count that both as course credit and in terms of your evaluation, it might be something worth revisiting.
Well, we get lists often of these students worked in the lab, or I have this many PhD students, but we don't get much evaluation of the quality of that. We
And
have
that
to
does
assume
vary.
that the quantity of them is a reflection of the quality of the instruction.
Right.
And it strikes me also that we're learning a lot from each other about how to teach better based on the evaluative mechanisms. I mean, we talk a lot about what makes a good classroom, but I don't think we've thought very much about what makes a good lab instructor or what makes a good dissertation director. How do you work most effectively in those realms? And that would be something that I would think would be really
But
interesting.
big data has the answer to
So-
that. Yeah.
So you're asking a deep research question, not one that we can answer by just sort of writing up a couple of questions and asking somebody. You're asking the causal effect of a researcher, of a professor or a mentor on the student. So let's first define the quantity of interest, what we actually care about, and then let's figure out how we can estimate it, right? So let's just separate the two. So the thing that we actually want to know is you have two students that are identical, let's imagine, coming through the program, and one is mentored by me and one is mentored by someone else. And we want to know what the effect is of their whole career and how much they liked it and all of the outcomes that you could possibly think of. That's a very difficult thing to estimate. In the last 20 or 30 years, actually, we've learned a lot about causal inference. This is a very difficult subject. We could design studies to answer this question. You match students that are not exactly the same, and you correct for the fact that they differ in certain ways. You can't randomly assign them to faculty. Right, they get to choose, but those are threats to inference that we can deal with. It's a big research project, but I think we should engage in it.
And I'm thinking just about a very utilitarian dimension of knowing that is, let's say you're a scientist in a lab and you have 9 students working with you, and there's another scientist who has 2, and that scientist is aware she or he is struggling to figure out why don't more students want to work with me? It's not my field. What is it that you could say to that person, or that somebody could say to that person about what your magic fairy dust is that the other person doesn't have? Do we know that?
I don't think we do, because if we observe differences between the two, there's an entirely different question. Like, so we observe these differences. I do this thing, they do that thing, right? I have 2 students, they have 10 students. And so if I start, then there's an entirely different question, which is, suppose I start to do what that person's doing. Would I get 10 students, or would I lose my 2 students? Right? We know democracies do better than non-democracies, but we know also that when you take a non-democracy and you try to make it a democracy, that doesn't actually work. Right?
That's great. Doug, you said something a minute ago that raises a question in my mind about the moment in which we find ourselves, and it was your comment that the most meaningful experience for a science student is almost inevitably a laboratory experience rather than a classroom experience. And as you said that, I was thinking about the implications of that for digital learning and how we now are in a moment where we need to say, we have residential education, which is incredibly complicated, incredibly expensive, because we believe it cannot be replaced entirely by learning online. So what are the aspects of the residential face-to-face in Cambridge or in Boston experience that we need to foreground and nurture? And what have the digital tools added to your quiver in terms of teaching options? And how do you see the relationship between what you do face-to-face and what you can't do face-to-face?
Well, there's a lot in there. I would say the digital tools have been extremely valuable in sort of data transfer, so that you could say gets around just a lot of data dumping to students for facts they can learn on their own, and they're very good at that. But your point about hands-on experience, which is almost a hackneyed term, is extremely important in my area of the life sciences. So you can watch a video of a mouse being dissected, but it's nothing like picking that mouse up, killing it, slicing it open, and looking at inside its body parts.
Thank God.
That's something. That's something you don't ever forget the first time you looked inside a mouse. And that's true for all aspects of sort of experimental science. And again, in my field, in biomedicine, we are, I think, unquestionably in the richest community of that in the world. There's opportunities for the students to work in the biotech industry, at the hospitals. that is nothing you can even come close to experiencing online. And to your point, I think that is something we should emphasize for the residential learning, is that hands-on experience of dealing with nature. That's something you just can't do. Even though I do like those Attenborough nature programs, whatever they're called, Planet Earth, but I've learned a lot from them. It's just different doing it yourself.
And evaluating how we're getting the proper balance or not as this is evolving.
Well, of course, hands-on experiences are much more expensive, but I wouldn't be opposed to reducing the number of classes students took and increasing their laboratory experiences.
There's hands-on in the humanities, absolutely. For me, what comes to mind is in Houghton Library, you know, you get to handle books that are hundreds of years old. It's the oldest thing most students will ever touch, barring some European building from the Middle Ages, maybe. But it's very powerful for them. And it is something that obviously can only be done in small numbers. And yet it's well worth the considerable expense. That's one of the great privileges of being here.
Yeah. And it goes back in some ways, I think, to what Gary said early on about what people remember is something that they're emotionally linked to. And a live experience has, I think, more emotional resonance than a digital mediated one.
Absolutely. Books are now digitized, and they're great tools for accessing the text at any hour and looking at it closely and zooming in and all that good stuff. But I really hope that digital engagement is married to a physical one, where you still see the book itself, and you can ask different kinds of questions from looking at the object itself.
Should we be taking this into account in some way? And should we be concerned about colleagues, or should students be concerned about colleagues who aren't taking advantage of these opportunities? Is that an important dimension of how we think about our teaching?
If we actually do the research and we demonstrate that it has an effect, then there has to be a reason to not use it. But I don't think we know the answers to all the questions yet, or to many of them.
Well, and obviously a colleague designing your own form of experience is the key element. And for some people, it may be a really engaging discussion on a difficult topic, could have a similarly powerful experiential component to working in a lab or going to see a rare book. So I wouldn't want to put any constraints on what constitutes active learning in that way, or hands-on learning.
One of the elements that we often use as a justification purpose for a liberal arts education is to talk about critical thinking and ways of thinking. Do we understand that and how we're doing in meeting that goal? Is there a way to see an evolution? I know there was a critical thinking exam that was given in a number of institutions, and I think it was difficult for our students. I mean, it was so easy for our students, actually, that we didn't get much variation. They all turned out to be fabulous critical thinkers on this scale. So it was scale-prong, I guess. But are there ways that you evaluate that? You evaluate whether you're succeeding at that in your students, with your students? Can I go tell everybody in Congress that we're building critical thinkers and I have the evidence to prove it?
I'm not sure I know what critical thinking means, but in the sciences, one thing we try to do is to force students to design experiments that answer questions about the unknown. So if that's critical thinking, then I think that is an important thing about what we do. Rather than telling them what is known, saying these are interesting problems, how would you solve it? And I'd hope that we teach them the kind of disciplinary knowledge they need to know what techniques and approaches they could take to a problem. But that's when they get most excited, is something where they can make, as Anne said, a discovery. And in another way, you make me think about how do we encourage curiosity rather than simply what I call data transfer. That's really what's so exciting in the freshmen, is they're just curious about everything.
I'd say in history, we've built our sophomore tutorial around writing and rewriting and critically engaging with secondary sources and primary sources. And I really do think we see a progression in the way students write at the beginning of the term and at the end. In particular, the big hurdle usually is the concept of historiography. In other words, of what other historians have said about the past and how you can engage with the past in conversation with those historians. And it's not what people expect when they walk into a history course. And it takes a certain amount of, sort of going over it from multiple angles. But I hope that by the end of the semester, most people have gotten that key move, the sort of meta move. Mm-hmm. And, they may or may not deploy it later, but the whole point is to create that possibility for example, a senior thesis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on critical thinking? Big data on critical thinking?
Well, I mean, like Doug, I also don't know exactly what it means, and that's definitely not the right thing to say to members of Congress. I would say that it basically involves some kind of deep thinking about a subject, which involves a real motivation. It sort of connects all the things that we've been talking about. And so what I was thinking about when you were talking is sometimes I get to talk to a student and they tell me, they explain their paper to me. This is back to my theme about getting them involved in research. And either they're involved in my research or I'm helping them with their research. And there's a moment, in addition to the one I described earlier, where I say, aha, where I point out something in their research and I say, I didn't know this. And they look at me and they say, what do you mean you didn't know that? You're the professor. And I say, and then I get to say, no, you don't understand. Not only did I not know this, but no one in the history of the world has ever known this, and you know this, right? Like I remember when I was a sophomore, and I had that experience, and I thought, like, I don't know what cocaine is, but I'm glad I had this first, because I have to do it again and again, and that's the kind of thing that. It's not critical thinking, it's motivation. But once you have that motivation, you devote all of your efforts to it. You think critically, you think obsessively, you work on it. So.
I love the cocaine.
Yeah.
In the course of the discussion so far, a couple of you have raised the issue of vulnerability. And when Doug said he finds it hard to read his teaching evaluations, and I have to say, if he finds it hard to read his teaching evaluations, I can imagine they're only wonderful, Doug. So.
No, they're not.
But what about that element? Aaron was talking about it, that to be open to evaluation, to really make evaluations work, we have to have a willingness for faculty to be vulnerable. And Aaron talked about building communities of trust and a variety of other ways of enhancing that welcoming of critical feedback. How do you see that among your colleagues? Do you think it is a problem as we consider trying to enhance our evaluative capacity?
And what would get my attention is if the university announced that next term when I teach, say, Introduction to Human Development, there would be faculty members from other departments that came to take the class and evaluate my teaching. That would get my attention. I'd be really interested to know what a historian thought about how I teach that introductory course.
And I think it'll be really fun for me to attend such a course. I think that's right, creating a community of teachers who can talk about this. So at the level of the department, at the first level, and then beyond that would be really valuable, not in terms of, just because talking about teaching makes us all conscious of what we do, often, frankly, out of imitation or out of expediency because we've run out of other ideas. And looking to someone else in this spirit of exchange and trust would be fantastic.
Looking to a professional teacher.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So sort of normalize imperfection in a way. Gary, what do you think?
We should collect all this information. We don't know exactly what to collect. Having teachers in the back of the room would definitely get my attention. But how should I react to their opinions? Like you said something that sounded clear to me. Okay, that's fine, but was it actually clear to the freshmen in my class? I don't know. And that person doesn't necessarily know the answer to the question, so eliciting that person's opinions might not be the right answer. On the other hand, they might have useful feedback for certain purposes. So I just think that there's a lot more information we could collect. It's becoming so much more easier to do. It can be used for so many more purposes. Just think of students. Where do they get advice about what subjects to take? The other students in their entryway, right? Well, now it's pretty easy to collect, and we should collect the whole path that every student takes all the way through Harvard, and pretty much everything that happens to them. And then we do that for a little while, and then the next freshman that comes into the dorm and asks a question, they can also ask their friends. But we can also give them the advice from the last 5,000 people that have gone through Harvard and give them much more systematic information. It doesn't tell them what to do. It just says, you know, you've taken this course, and then this course, and then this course, and you've had this experience. You know, at that point, there's been about 50 people that have gone that path, and they've forked off into 2 directions. Here are those directions. These are interesting things. You might actually want to know that. So that's useful for the students, and this very similar kinds of information we could have for faculty. You know, if people have a, let's say, 50-year teaching experience, that's an N of 50. That's 50 observations of teaching evaluations. We could give them an enormous amount of more information than that they couldn't have done in 1875.
I think it would be really salutary in many ways, too, and very valuable for the humanities, because I think we'd find many maps of people who went through Harvard concentrating in the humanities and are now running the world. They're not unemployed. They're not living in their mother's basement. They're running the world. And that would be helpful, I think, in making the case for choice and selection and variety in what students are doing.
I do worry a little bit about the big data and how the individual, you know, is still, it just can feel like a cog or a statistic. And you want to preserve the sense of themselves as blazing their trail.
Right.
So it would have to be presented with care. And also the idea that we do, in fact, know every time they swiped into their dorm and wherever they went. But, you know, in fact, we don't use that information because we want people to be able to live the way I feel I lived, largely untracked in the old days. And I just sort of worry a little bit about creating so much self-consciousness. And so there's a balance. It can be there if you want to know, maybe, rather than.
We should do it in a way that helps.
Right.
So yes, there's definitely huge disadvantages. But these are things that are possible now that have never been possible before. We can use them in really bad ways. We ought to be able to use them that empowers the students. So for technology, we always say there's a continuum from fully automated, which is like a driverless car where you don't tell it where to go, to fully human, where a human being it's no longer possible for them to include all the information that they have access to. What you really want is something in the middle.
Right.
And it's not only a balance, really. It's computer assisted human-led technology. That's really what you want. But you want it assisted in the right way, so that you get to lead, right? If we have a whole bunch of computers that go to school, that's fine. But that's not what we're after.
So we have just a few minutes left, and so what I want to do is ask each of you if you could do one thing to advance the evaluation of teaching at Harvard. What would be, not that it would be the only thing, but the first thing. And I'm going to leave Gary last because he's going to give us a whole research plan that we will embark on. So Doug, I'll start with you. What would be one step that you would take to improve the evaluation of teaching?
I think I come back to this thing I said earlier on, is I'd like to know what has changed students' lives when they reflect on it 5 to 10 years after they graduate. So not whether they got into graduate school or medical school, but are they happy with their life? What did they learn in our concentration in our classes? And what really mattered to them? And the trouble is I don't know how to ask that question. And you could ask it in a conversation, but I don't know how to ask it in a survey. But maybe the psychology and sociology departments can help figure out how do you probe that? Because that is, after all, the essence of a liberal arts education. It's not to learn a fact so that I can get a job. It's to change who you are. So it's not a very good answer. That's what I'd like to do, but I don't know how to do it.
I think it's a great answer.
I agree entirely that the conversation, actually the one-on-one conversation with the alum, the long-graduated student, is the greatest gift, you know, when a student comes back to town and gets in touch. And so that there's nothing that really, you can supplement it, but that's a key. Just obviously, it's a small piece of feedback. I suppose I would be interested in seeing more of the peer group faculty discussion and working with the Bach Center and amongst ourselves, maybe at the department level to start, because these conversations are still pretty new, actually. And obviously what Hilt has done and these kinds of gatherings have been really important. So creating more sense of shared interest in one another's teaching and just for fun, going to audit other people's classes, possibly just for the content, really, and B, to get ideas. I think that's a really low, obviously it would have to be voluntary, and it could be really rewarding for the people involved.
So the concept that teaching is a form of ongoing learning.
Absolutely.
So that you have to be vulnerable to learn, because it has to mean you don't know everything yet.
Right.
You don't have your perfect, what were they, 50-minute lectures in which they are entirely balanced and there wasn't time for one thing. Yeah, that's great. Okay, Gary.
Drew put me last because she knew I had no idea what the answer to the question was, and it would give me time to think. So what I would suggest is that, I'm still thinking. The most important innovation in statistics and data science in the last few centuries has been separating, as I did a minute ago, the quantity that we're trying to estimate from the way of estimating it. So I think we should completely separate that. Let's have a committee and have people come up with all of the things that we would actually like to know, separate from how we go and estimate it. Over time, it's going to be easier to estimate those things better and better. But let's figure out, unconstrained from the difficulties of actually doing it, what we would actually want to know. I think that would be enlightening. I think we've talked about a lot of them here. What we do is, before that innovation in statistics, people would conflate the two. They'd say, oh, we want to know about how well teachers are teaching, so we'll ask the students, and we'll write a question down. Actually, that's a really bad way. Writing a question down is not a bad way, but survey research is really difficult. Just one little eddy here. You think you can write a question that's really clear so a lot of other people can understand it. People that you don't know, people that you really don't know the details about of their personal lives. And you can do that. We all think we can do that, right? We'll just write it very clearly. After all, we're all writers, right? Okay, so you're not going to have any misunderstandings. But how often have you had misunderstandings, massive misunderstandings, with your spouse or your parents or your kids that you've known for 20 or 30 years, right? So like that, it's actually really difficult. So not only is it difficult to get it right and get the understanding right between two people, a little bit like what we were talking about earlier, but figuring out whether that actually estimates the thing that we care about is an entirely separate question. So I would hope that we would separate the two. The second is a research project, absolutely as you said. But the first one is we might be able to set up what our goals are. And so let's have a committee and focus on that.
Well, thank you. This was extraordinarily rich discussion, and I certainly learned a lot, and I'd evaluate your teaching just now as really outstanding. So thank you very much. Thank you.